alla mattina, appena alzata. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Welcome back to the Working Class History Podcast and the concluding part of our double episode on Asian youth movements in Bradford in conversation with Tariq Mehmood. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first. While based on the self-organisation of young Asian people, the Asian Youth Movement, AYM, also tried to build solidarity with the white working class. The aims and objectives of the Bradford group said that, quote, the only real force in British society capable of fighting racialism and the growth of organised racism and fascism is the unity of the workers' movement, black and white. And they encouraged Asian young people to join workers' organisations like trade unions and oppose racist elements within them.
Working class whites and trade union organisations were intricately involved in working with us. In fact, I think we could even have white people as members. I don't think that was an issue. We were, of course, remember, we would have been in the mining communities, in the Trades Council, in our friends and colleagues would be involved on the buses. We would be involved in trade union disputes. And so, in a way, we saw that our natural allies were progressive white people, particularly within working class communities, without which our struggle was doomed.
In its early days, AYM was a democratic, grassroots organisation funded entirely by its members. But as it grew, they sought out other methods of funding. And what happened as a result, we think, is a really important lesson for those of us involved in social movements today.
I used to be the only full-time worker for the Bradford Asian Youth Movement. And the members used to put 25 pence, which is £0.25, into a pot, out of which contribution was given to me, which would make my weekly income equivalent to an industrial average wage of the area. And I was bound to give a list of what I did and a report on a weekly basis, a written, not a bureaucratic report. We were all connected through financial donations and the justification for it. It was my job also to raise funding. And the very first time that I raised funding with the help of other colleagues and comrades in the organization, I think we raised £3,000 or so from the CRE, which is the Commission for Racial Equality. Now, all of a sudden, the organization changed, which I had helped to build, dramatically. My wage shot up, and no longer from a 25p contribution per person. We had a telephone in this building which we used as an office. Not a single phone prior to that could be made which wasn't essential and which we didn't log. Nothing could be spent on anything which wasn't logged. And all of a sudden, the executive committee could use the phone, but the ordinary members couldn't use the phone. If everyone used the phone, 200 of us, we couldn't afford to pay the bill. We suddenly had money in the account. And before, if we wanted to fill a coach to go on a demonstration, not only did we have to mobilize people, and very often we went to demonstrations in London. On one occasion, I think we helped to fill 11 coaches. We would have to pay for the coaches, pay for the food to feed people. And it was really not difficult. Everyone shared. It wasn't a burden. And we were the poorest section of society. Everyone was incredibly generous. But all of a sudden, when you've got thousands in your bank account, in those days, that's a lot of money. Why on earth would somebody pay 25 pence towards my salary? And I saw corruption setting in. I saw an organization which had a daily contact with its membership based on the fact that we were all contributing and making a payment. I felt that I had helped beginning to create a process which in anything positive. So in a sense, I had a big reflective crisis within myself. And I sat and discussed with other people. And we came to a conclusion, really, that if we spent the money which we'd been given as a grant, we were going to be audited by the organization that gives us money. And in fact, we were legally liable to be audited by the state structures as well, should they choose. So all of a sudden, an anti-imperialist, anti-racist organization, which was only responsible to its members and its people, all of a sudden becomes responsible and held down, which I felt was a gun on its head, that it is held to account by the very forces that it set out to fight against. And the very forces that it's fighting against, who are dividing our communities, begin to fund it to be more effective. Now, this contradiction couldn't end happily, so we concluded that a people's organization can only be responsible to the people. Yes, it must be audited. Yes, if there is money going through, we should be responsible. And to those who are funding us, that's the question. But who should be those who are funding us? And never in the history of my organizational time then or post AYM were we ever not able to do something because of lack of money. But we certainly were divided because of its existence. So we took up a decision. And in fact, the Asian Youth Movement, we took a vote, and I know some of the people have denied it since then. We were very narrowly won as well. It was only 1 or 2 votes, if I remember, when we split, that we couldn't remain in the organization that accepted money from the state. Now, it's very important to understand that we weren't talking if you had a job in a community center where it didn't mean you couldn't be a youth worker. What we said was that youth didn't need youth workers, they needed work. So we were always on a slightly different conjecture. So I suppose the summary of our position on funding would be that it's okay to sell your labor, even in the wrong place. After all, I worked in a mill where we were making, factory where we were making plastic bits, which was meant for some air force or other, and you actually understand, but you knew the order was from there, and so you were forced to work on making bits of plastic or whatever else we made. And so, wherever you work, it fed into the processes of the state. Doesn't mean you have to sell your soul. And that's where our contradiction lay. We departed and formed then the United Black Youth League, which consisted of African, Caribbean, and Asian youth at the time.
Due to the predominantly male demographics of the local community, AYM was overwhelmingly male, but later this did begin to change slightly.
Yeah, I think in the Bradford at the early phase, there was only one. I mean, she was very active. When we split away from the Asian youth movement and formed the United Black Youth League, we had a little bit more involvement of women, but our organization was very short-lived. But more women were involved in places like Manchester, if you like, or in Haringey and in other cities. The North and South had a very clear-cut divide as well. Remember, the North was much more poorer, and in fact, it still is. The most deprived communities in the North are ours. The North was poorer, the migration was primarily male, and it didn't help the macho culture that we created as well. So whilst there were, as I said, in my school, there was only one, or maybe God knows what she was doing with 300 boys, it must have been a dreadful time for her. So, but then, yes, that was the case. But interaction in social events, that was a little bit different. But things changed now. That is no longer the case. One of the greatest involvement in social and political movements, from Stop the War to anything else, is the involvement of who would have been young women at the time, and including the young women of today.
Shanaz Ali, a member of the United Black Youth League, UBYL, also described difficulties in getting involved in the group because of family attitudes. Her father would ask, "What are people going to say?" And she'd have to make up excuses to go on demonstrations, and was pretty much excluded from social activities because she wasn't able to stay out late. We're going to talk about issues related to women's involvement in Asian youth movements in much more detail in a future episode. By the time the UBYL was set up in 1981, other events had helped shape the national political landscape.
The this, again, I have to go back a little while. So 1981 is quite an important year for many, many things. I think the New Cross massacre takes place in 1981 of 13 black youth who were burnt in a fire in London. So we are in South London, in New Cross. So we are also witnessing these, I think it's in the July sometime, the fighting within Southall, where the fascists skinheads tried to hold a meeting in a pub, and the pub is burnt down by the youth of Southall. We're also beginning to see discontent in many different places up and down the country in working class areas. This is an era of Margaret Thatcher's realm that she's come to power, a sort of a new Reaganite, Thatcherite alliance. And in that period, there were rumors in Bradford, but 10, 11 days before the July the 11th, in that whole month, there were strife and struggle in many different working class areas where youth were beginning to rebel against the local conditions, whatever they may be. We weren't connected to them organically, but we were, as youth, we were, as people, suffering our own thing.
The UBYL engaged in similar activities to AYM, including some joint campaigns supporting migrants, and they helped defend demonstrations from fascist attack.
We went into once to show solidarity with some event in Coventry. This was a United Black Youth League. There were people in military uniform. I think it was the paratroop regiment's uniform, who were, on the other side of the demonstration. And on the way out, we were attacked by fascists underneath the subways and literally had a punch up, the women that were with us were the ones who never withdrew.
As an example, one of their campaigns was a defence of Gary Pemberton, an Afro-Caribbean security guard who worked at Bradford College and was convicted of assaulting a police officer in a bar. Members of the United Black Youth League at the college knew Gary and liked him a lot, and knew that the police officer must have been lying about him. So they set up the Gary Pemberton Defence Campaign. They mobilised public support and publicly named and shamed the officer who attacked him as Colin Malcolm Mackenzie. The campaign was successful, and it became clear that it was the police who first attacked Gary, and his conviction was overturned at appeal. This was something which very much antagonised the local police, and this defence campaign was one which the AYM, at that time pursuing greater respectability, didn't support. At the beginning of 1981, AYM started getting close to the Labour Party. Previously, their view was articulated in the slogan, "Labour, Tory, both the same, both play the racist game," given that both parties enacted racist and anti-worker policies, a good example being Labour's Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1968. When facing a potential influx of Kenyan Asian refugees fleeing persecution, the government reduced the rights of British subjects in Commonwealth countries to stop non-white immigration. Previously, citizens of the Commonwealth had the right to enter the UK, but Labour changed it so that only citizens with one parent or grandparent born in the UK could enter, effectively meaning only white people. The AYM had also barred dual membership to prevent left parties infiltrating it or taking it over. But it turned out that its chairperson, Marsha Singh, had secretly been a member of the Labour Party and gradually tried to recruit more. Going back to the United Black Youth League, one summer's day in 1981, a rumour began circulating. And given that gangs of fascists and racist skinheads had been going around attacking people in black and Asian areas, sometimes firebombing homes and businesses, it wasn't an unbelievable rumour either.
On July the 11th, the 1981, there were rumors that fascists were going to come, skinheads, coachloads of skinheads, were going to come to Bradford. And police told us to remain indoors. We took the complete opposite position, not unsimilar to 1976. The similarity this time being that we're organized. We are organized, we can meet, we can hold committee meetings, we can plan streets, we can plan defense, we can call out people, and we are armed. And I think that's where we have a right to bear arms, what we think is necessary for that time. And so this moment, there are riots on that day right up and down the length and breadth of the country, and similarly in Bradford. But they're not race riots, contrary to all the nonsense that was pumped out at the time. We called people to protect the city centre. The largest group that turned up were white kids, not Asians, not Afro-Caribbeans. Perhaps we were the only one amongst those groups of people who were organized. So we'd already taken a decision that certain ones bombs, certain ones would go into the different areas and different sections of the city center. We would cities, different zones, and we would congregate at a certain time, communicate with each other through phone calls to different people's houses and so on. And we met in town. No skinheads came. Nothing actually happened until the police arrested me and a few of my friends being ringleaders, but ringleaders of nothing. There was no trouble at all. And they picked us up and threw us into the cells and charged us. I can't remember what the charges were on that day, to which they made us plead guilty as well, which we later on appealed, and we won against those charges. But that would have been after my second arrest, which a few weeks later, we were arrested on charges of terrorism to destroy buildings and cause injury to people.
What Tariq said a few seconds ago was a bit hard to hear because of a Skype glitch. So the missing bit was that some people had homemade petrol bombs.
And we met in town. No skinheads came. Nothing actually happened until the police arrested me and a few of my friends being ringleaders, but ringleaders of nothing. There was no trouble at all. And they picked us up and threw us into the cells and charged us. I can't remember what the charges were on that day, to which they made us plead guilty as well, which we later on appealed, and we won against those charges. But that would have been after my second arrest, which a few weeks later, we were arrested on charges of terrorism to destroy buildings and cause injury to people.
I did ask Tariq what he meant when he said we were armed, if he meant anything other than Molotov cocktails.
There was aspects of us which had more, during the course of the day, but none of them, none of these weapons were in any way intended to be used against the police. So, but they were really there because we were worried to burn our streets down. We were worried there could be serious loss of life, given the whole sort of momentum of the 5-6 months, in particular the last 11 to 12 days. So what we had done is I had called for the making of petrol bombs, as I was one of the leaders of the organization. It's not something I denied in court, incidentally, either. So yes, that was, in a sense, our process of arming ourselves. But most importantly, it was a political decision, not a spur of the moment decision. It was weighing up certain things. We met, we discussed, we planned. And once you have an embryonic organizational structure, it's quite amazing to watch how far you can actually go if you've got support of people.
The incident hit headlines around the country, with the press using sensationalist language like black gang in plot to bomb police, and talking about police finding bomb factories and seizing at least 100 bombs and the like. It fed nicely into the narrative they were already pushing about feral black rampaging mobs, spreading, quote, terror to police and good citizens alike, something which unfortunately crops up again and again in different years and different contexts, from the talk about super predators from the Clintons in the 90s to the so-called no-go areas on Fox News today.
After we were arrested, it was painted as a sensational police operation capturing, a load of potential terrorists and stuff like that. So we were also charged with terrorism offenses in the initial stages. I think there were 3. So the media reflected that sort of a sensationalism, that following the riots, police were able to thwart a sort of some sort of a terrorist attack. Widely covered, and the trial was widely covered as well, but that's much later on. And in a way, what was more significant than the media coverage was the people's coverage and people's reactions, if you like. From what I heard, of course, we were inside that. I think around about 600 or 700 people attended the very first meeting that was organized in Bradford following our arrest. And it's important to understand that we weren't outsiders who'd flown into a community to give leaflets out. We lived there. 12 people have a lot of relatives as well. And it wasn't just 12 that were arrested, 12 were charged. Many others were arrested. It was almost exclusive. It was mostly the United Black Youth League cadre that were arrested, but also people from the Asian Youth Movement were arrested as well, from which, as I mentioned earlier, we'd split into two factions of the youth organization in Bradford. And they weren't charged. On top of this, many of our members also were charged. African members particularly were arrested, but they weren't charged with terrorism offenses. So there was quite a lot of a hullabaloo around the thing. And that big meeting would begin the process, which would result in a campaign to have us released. And also the fact that we had been working with many different oppressed groups, both nationally and internationally, that would then be reflected in support from people such as the Irish, such as other people engaged in struggle. There is a list on 140 organizations in different countries, or I can't remember now, but a very substantial number of organizations did support us. Strangely enough, not the one I founded, the Bradford Asian Youth Movement. They took a decision not to support the Bradford 12 formally, but of course individually their members did, including from the top to the bottom, because we were all so closely connected. But I think the reason they did that was so that their image wouldn't get tarnished in the coming months and years, where some of them had political ambitions and others had to raise funds, and it wouldn't go well to be associated with people charged on terrorist offenses and also to be raising funds and so on. But that's not to say that I didn't appreciate, or we didn't appreciate, the huge support that individuals did. So they formally took a decision, we want, as an organization. So you won't see the name of the Asian Youth Movement, which is sad in a way, as history has developed. So once we were arrested, we were taken into Bradford police station, where we were held. I forget now how long we were held there for, probably a week or so, or 10 days, or before we were transferred formally into Armley jail for the ones who were beyond, because some of them were young at the moment. So some went into the young offenders prison, and we went into the offenders prison, the adult prison in Leeds, where of course we would then meet. We would be supported by African and particularly Irish prisoners, especially the Republican ones. So when we are arrested, we are. It's quite shocking at the time when you're first arrested. You don't really believe. I never believed it was really that serious until I saw the charges. Then I knew I wasn't coming out. And then we knew, once we met our solicitors, our absolutely fabulous solicitors, who were working with us, incidentally, way before our arrest as well, especially a wonderful woman called Ruth Bundy from Leeds. So we are held in Armley jail, which is an old creaking jail. The prisoners, we had a rough time, but because we were political prisoners, so we were Category A prisoners in there. And it's not nice being a Category A prisoner. It's quite a lot of restrictions until the Category A status, eventually after appeals and stuff, was lifted off us, that we were treated very differently to criminal prisoners inside, both by the establishment and by prisoners themselves. So that, and what kept us going, certainly what kept our morale high, was the fact that thousands and thousands of people in Britain of all races, of all colors and creeds and religions and none, as well as internationally, kept sending us solidarity messages. And we also knew of our innocence. I never doubted for a moment that any of us were guilty, because we hadn't planned to attack shops. And what the police had said, we were going to attack shops with petrol bombs and we were going to attack the police station. This was complete nonsense. They had just made a mountain out of a molehill. What we'd said for sure was that if they came, the fascists and the skinheads came through our areas, and then, yes, if we felt the need there to use petrol bombs to defend ourselves, we would.
In a parallel situation, a decade earlier, John Barker and 7 others were put on trial for one of the same alleged crimes, conspiracy to cause explosions, related to the Angry Brigade, and had substantial outside support from social movements. A key difference being that John was guilty. We speak to John about this in our podcast episodes 2 and 3. Although Tariq was unaware of that case, like John, Tariq decided to defend himself.
And of course, in the trial, I defended myself. I didn't have a barrister. I took the decision to defend myself with the support of my friends. And that was primarily for the reason that I thought if we go to jail and we end up doing 3 life sentences, by the time we come out, we will be old men. And I didn't want somebody else to make statements on my behalf, because actually for us, the case was very, very simple, that we were not guilty as charged. We were certainly, you could argue, and they did, is it right to arm yourself, to defend yourself? These were the core questions of the time. And we said yes. We didn't hide about it. We didn't say we're sorry. The arguments that were put in is, what sort of a society are you going to live in if you release these men for what they've alleged and accepted to have done, namely that they've made petrol bombs and armed themselves and said they will use them? What sort of world will you want to live in? And we said, well, if you release us, I certainly did, we will do exactly the same again if confronted by the same situation, because the right of self-defense is a human right. It's not a legal thing that you give us, and we haven't broken a law, and that is what we argued. And of course, if you do it as an individual, it's different. We did it as a political organization, whilst maintaining that the police were neither capable nor interested in defending us, that they were an oppressive arm of the state, and all this would come out in our trial. But really, we wouldn't have been freed. We would have lost the case if we relied solely on the law. That we did not win legally, we won politically first. And because we had a campaign outside, every day there were demonstrations outside the courtroom, there were publicity campaigns, and what that gave, it kept us in the public eye. We had to fight to have a multicultural, multiracial jury. Otherwise, they were going to give us an all-white jury. I mean, almost certainly, we would have refused to stand trial had they insisted on an all-white jury, and we would probably then have been convicted. And certainly, we were pretty determined that we're not going to stand. They won't understand what we're talking about, because there was historical basis. Now, if you remember what I had said before, that here, the campaigns that we did, I can't remember if I mentioned it before or not. Some of the campaigns we did in the Asian youth movements would be campaigns such as for uniting families. One in particular that we were very active was a case of a woman called Anwar Ditta, a remarkable woman who wanted her children to come to England. She was born in England. They wouldn't let her. They said, they're not your children. And we had no legal way of winning, but we did win in the end because we had faith in mobilizing people. Now, Bobby Sands wrote her a poem from prison after I think he'd become an MP, pre-hunger strike or before that, I can't remember. So that act of solidarity that we were doing with the Irish hunger strikers, their words were coming back to us in poems that we published as well. That poem is available on the Tandana website, as well. So that would then be reflected in Irish youth in Belfast and other places supporting the Bradford 12. And after we were acquitted, we were invited by the leadership of Sinn Féin to come to Ireland, which we did. And we met them. We also met our friends in the both wings of the Republican movement at the time. And in fact, we stood behind when the volleys used to be fired in the martyrs' graveyard with the helicopters flying above. So some of us stood there as a gesture of solidarity right next to the volunteers firing into the air, so that these were not simply little solidarity gestures that didn't mean anything. These were very concrete steps that the movement then assisted us. And without the very broad-based support from across the world, this included Turks, Pakistanis, Indians, all forms of nationalities, I don't think we would have been acquitted. I think we would have lost. And we also had a fantastic legal team as well. Some of them are still going strong, very strong and still fighting. And we are still in contact with each other, solicitors, including barristers. And many of the radical barristers of today were born out of the struggle of yesterday, especially within the Bradford 12, for the Bradford 12.
Bradford 12 support groups were formed in several cities. They picketed every court appearance of the 12, organised demonstrations in Bradford, Leeds and even Los Angeles. Trade unions, socialist groups, religious groups, disabled activists, LGBT groups like the Gay Liberation Front and radical lesbians all joined the campaign, and there was a Women's Day of Action held in support as well. Trotskyist groups like the Socialist Workers' Party saw the Bradford 12 as black separatists, which of course they weren't, and so didn't prioritise the campaign, even expelling 2 of their own members over it. Initially the jury was all white, but pressure from the 12, their legal team and the campaign eventually forced the court to expand the jury pool to include black and Asian people, as well as white working class people. Juries are one of the only places in British society where ordinary people can still wield a significant amount of power. And as in the Angry Brigade trial in the 70s and many other political trials around that time, the makeup of the jury, especially in terms of class, played a crucial role.
Yeah, there were Africans on the jury, there were Asians on the jury, working class white people, middle classes. We were very keen on the class dynamic as well. That was absolutely essential for us. I think the jury, in some of the jurors were the ones, I think the old African man had been involved in anti-colonial struggles in Africa. One of the white jurors, after we were acquitted, I have not forgotten it, she came into the bar we were celebrating in and had a flower in her hair. And there was some idiot, and the police were there as well, all around, in some of their represented in different sides. And somebody had put empty milk bottles as mock Molotov cocktails. She took the flower out of her hair and put it in the bottle. Then she took her T-shirt, the upper shirt off, and underneath she was wearing a Free the Bradford 12 T-shirt. So actually what had happened was that the police's overhandedness had really solidly convinced most of the jurors, not all, obviously, quite early on, that what they were doing was wrong, and they had overacted. And I think, in the Bradford 12, I don't think they should have charged us with what they did. Had there been lower charges, and it's important, I didn't know, I think 5 or 6 of the defendants who were charged with me. I'd never met them before. I'd met them in the prison. Had they done smaller charges of some form and not blown it out, trying to, get some glory out of us, try to get the dirty name sorted after the Ripper had been arrested and stuff. But these are all, I do remember once the bombers took off from, whilst we were in court, because they were off to bomb the Argentinians in the Malvinas Islands. This was all around the same time. And we heard the planes flying over, and I thought, and I just remembered thinking that actually nothing ever happens on its own. It's connected in 1,000 different strands. Not always overt, not always necessarily active, but all the connections are always there.
Defending yourself is something which has happened in a couple of political trials around the UK, which has had some successes. And it does give you as a defendant a bit of extra leeway to make points in court which you or your lawyer may not otherwise be able to do when confined by the strict roles of defence and counsel. But it's an extremely high-risk strategy. And I doubt if personally I'd be brave enough to risk it myself if I found myself in a similar situation. But with the Bradford 12 case, Tariq taking it on was agreed by a collective decision.
The barrister who was appointed to act on my behalf was called Ian MacDonald. He's very famous chambers of the MacDonald Chambers. And I sat with him and discussed the idea. So I was aware of political activists in the past defending themselves. And really, it's the understanding. It's very nerve-wracking and terrifying, ordeal at the time to defend yourself. But one of the things was I was aware, and for me, the trial became a political act of resistance as well. And we didn't, and my co-defendants were more important than anything else. I did put to them, I said, look, if we go down, I don't want to go down crawling. We should go down fighting and not apologetic. And I can't think of a better way. I think we should all do it, but if you don't, I want to do it. What do you say? And they all supported me. Had they not supported me, I would not have gone against the wishes of my own members.
The main thrust of their collective defence was that self-defence was no offence. Although with certain individuals their specific defence differed slightly. For example, one of those arrested had nothing to do with the Molotov cocktails and was just at home watching cricket at the time. The defendants also commissioned a report systematically cataloguing racist attacks in the Bradford area and the subsequent police inaction at best, or at worst complicity in those attacks. They used the police's own testimony to prove their case, for example getting the detective superintendent to say that he thought Enoch Powell wasn't a racist, and they also proved to the jury that the police had fabricated numerous reports, like claiming that Tariq had spoken about, quote, coloured people being, quote, less intelligent than police officers, which anyone who has heard Tariq speak for more than 5 minutes would know is not something that he would ever say. Eventually, the 12 were acquitted on all counts, as the jury accepted the basic principle of the defence, that communities had the right to defend themselves if the police would not do so. The need to free the Bradford 12 became by necessity the priority for members and supporters of the United Black Youth League, and it eventually ended up exhausting the organisation, so essentially it was ground down by police repression. On the other hand, the Asian youth movements which took on state funding went down a different route.
I think that firstly, we should understand that there was a time, movements of our time have a limited lifespan. We're not young forever. We don't have a parent body in which it could have dissolved. It wasn't like that. So the movement would have ended in one way, shape, or form anyway, because it was born for certain material conditions which had changed. Now, one of the people from the Asian youth movement became an MP, for Bradford, which I was very, very, very upset with. And, he was a good friend of mine, and he's unfortunately passed away now. Many of the people within the AYM, Asian youth movements, not just in Bradford now, but across the country, from Southall, in Birmingham, in Leicester, in Watford, Haringey, and East London. So there were a lot of them many of them got jobs. Some they became quite a comfortable middle class, if you like. And I think that when they were organizing, that gave them the tools of moving. So the movement would have become a little bit more respectful. I mean, we still meet here and there, some of us. But the decline has a fundamental economic decline is what would have led to that decline in any case. So it had already by mid-80s really finished in its heyday, if not earlier, possibly even shortly after our arrest, though they still did some good work, which we no longer did. We were shattered and smashed. So the movements ended partly due to the actions of the state, and they were very clear, the state set out to buy off and co-opt the emerging leadership within these movements. This is not an accident of history. This was a strategy of the state, that they fled them with money and bring them into the fold, bring them into a co-opted situation. So that happened right across the country. So in a way, and this has happened everywhere, in America, here, the co-option of movements is not something new. What was new was that it was for us. For the British state has been doing it for centuries, in different forms and different shapes.
Bradford AYM went on to start a youth centre, which further bureaucratised it and made it more dependent on local government funding, and its activities moved away from campaigning towards more things like sports and social activities. Meanwhile, activists started to get given jobs. One former member of AYM in Bradford, Gurnam Singh, described what happened to him. In the summer of 1981, rioting broke out in cities across the UK, primarily sparked by aggressive and racist policing. Lord Scarman conducted an inquiry into the biggest of the riots in Brixton, South London, and made recommendations on how to avoid them in future, which included things like forging better community relations. So it was in the wake of this inquiry that Gurnam Singh said that he was picked out of 300 candidates for an unqualified social work post because of his involvement in anti-racist politics. He said that for him what was happening, quote, was a clear illustration of the incorporation of black politics into the state, and describes his former comrades being given state jobs and, quote, becoming suit-wearing and totally abandoning the struggle altogether, or taking the struggle into the state. Between 1981 and 1984, the local Labour Council in Bradford established or recognised different official groups to divide up and provide representation to different religious groups, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. This is basically how liberal democratic states deal with working class movements and movements of oppressed groups. Ones that they can't just stop outright or ignore, they'll try to divide, recuperate and co-opt them by splitting them up and bringing them into state structures. In Britain, that's often through the Labour Party or bodies set up by Labour politicians or local authorities. And more militant wings of movements, which can't be co-opted, reap the repressive force of the state, the court system, the police and the prisons. Despite this, these movements of Asian young people, alongside the struggles of Asian workers, did have a massive concrete impact, firstly at a grassroots level amongst the working class.
But I can tell you that there is amongst, those, even the very people that were sometimes fighting against us, there was a change, and people did change. People changed from racist to anti-racist, from Zionists to anti-Zionists. People changed.
Secondly, these movements helped put an end to many of the worst types of discrimination and forced British capitalism and the state to adapt and adopt a more friendly, multicultural face rather than an openly oppressive, racist one.
First and foremost, we declared our right to live. That was the very first thing that we did. Secondly, what we were able to do is to say that the life that we must be allowed to live must be one of dignity. And the dignity is not something reserved for us because we happen to have come over to the metropolis as an act of favor, but as an act of history, as an economic act where, and a social act. And I believe we had a huge impact. The impact of many people became, quite comfortable middle classes, including me, really. And we affected social change from the bottom to the top of this society and inspired people across the world who in turn inspired us. So yes, indeed, I think that one of the tragedies we would not have allowed in those days, because we were organized, 2 to 10 fascists to march through our areas. I mean, look at the situation today. There's hundreds of them. They outnumber the anti-fascists at time. This was unheard of. And I think that was the legacy and achievement of the smashing of the trade unions, the loss of a unified international left, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, however much we might have despised them, and we did. I think it was one of the greatest losses in modern times, which gave birth to the world that we live in. So in terms of what we did, we were forever active. We were helping the miners were helping us. We affected the trade union movement. And more importantly, we built our resistance on the generation that came before us. They weren't our enemies. They were our forefathers and foremothers. And that's not simply those from Asia, all of them. And there was a black movement. It was not a black and Asian movement. All non-white people called themselves black because racism had defined that ideology. We had not created that definition. This brown and these things, these are modern day phenomena to divide that movement, partly through funding and partly through things. We created an education, we altered the basis of education. We affected educational curriculums. We affected the policies of housing. We affected, unfortunately, we didn't win in every battle, but we didn't lose in any. That was very important. And the fact that the world has become a much darker, sinister place, that's not simply because of a little place like Bradford, but that is right across. This is now the era of monsters. And there has always been an era of monsters in one sense, but the monstrosity had a resistance to it. It's the lack of that resistance. And some of the problems that which we identified then, we said to our white comrades, please go organized amongst white people, go and organize anti-racist movements within white communities, not with us. The problem does not lie here. And I think these were fundamental failings of the left of that time. The trade unions, we altered as well. We brought politics to the trade union movement. They were into economics. Our workers brought in, the black workers, the Africans, the Asians, they brought in a whole political dimension to trade union struggle. Remember, these huge organizations of the Indian Workers Association were formed, who were affected by communist parties and social parties and socialist parties from the subcontinent. And similarly with other places, we also were able to unify with Africans. And, especially we did a lot of work in the 80s with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and other organizations. And these were great moments in history. Now, I think that those moments are coming again. I think that because we live in an era of monsters, people don't have any choice. Either you will be trampled over or you will have to resist. And there's no other way, really. There's no magic solution. The only solution lies in resistance.
But sadly, many of the problems still remain today, albeit in slightly different forms.
In our time, a lot of the racist violence was directed against males. Today, the violence is very often and predominant in many, many cases against women, particularly Muslim women, who, especially those who wear the hijabs. And the resistance to it, of the women resist. But the way that the organizations that we'd formed, that's not there. That's a missing component. But surely the era of today must throw out a new form and a new groups. But the groups and formations, there is a lot of people in mainstream political parties, whether it be the Labour, Lib Dems or the Tories, but I'm not sure that that is the route for a future. I think these are the sappings of energy. But I think the change has already been made. And one important lesson that you learn as organizers is that you can never undo political activity. So what we've done, we've done. And history doesn't stop for me, and it won't stop for you or any of the ones who listen. But what will happen is it's never the straw that bends that changes the fundamental flow of the wind. It's the one that stands firm. That's what changes the thing, and that's what we tried to do.
4 decades on, I asked Tariq what the main thing was he learned from taking part in those struggles.
I think really when I look back from today is an infinitely worse time than it was in our time. We felt what the struggles achieve is give us a sense of hope that when we are actively engaged in resistance, whether it be to unite a family, whether it be to fight for basic resources in impoverished neighborhoods, whether it be to take on fascists or whatever the nature of that struggle is, you can't struggle with a pessimistic attitude towards the world or life. You have to struggle with a belief that you will win, because the victory always is first and foremost in the fact that we resist, that we fight, we say no. We stand up for what is right, what we believe is right, not what somebody else says. And most importantly, it actually makes you a humbled person, that you can link with other people only if you stand up and fight for your own rights. You can't fight and show solidarity with others. But really, it's also the best university in the world for working people, is that we don't need, I've now got qualifications and stuff. I had nothing at all, not absolutely 1 or 2 meaningless qualifications at the time. But we I don't believe these high-powered, you know, uh, things like, you know, empowerment and all these catchphrases that are thrown around by funding agencies. That I think that the best hope we have of any meaningful, better future is if we actually organize, and organizing isn't that difficult. You meet, you talk on social media, you talk in real life, and you use the tools of all everyday stuff. I mean, you know, to produce a leaflet was really very difficult. It cost money and a lot of time, but we did it. To produce posters, to go and talk and knock on doors is what we did. But most importantly, we had a world vision. We had a world view, and we felt we were part of an international struggle, even if we were living in a tiny little city of Bradford or wherever we were connected to the world, and the world belonged to us. The other side, I would say to people listening to this, is that one of the things that we certainly believed in, we didn't want crumbs. We didn't even want the cake. We just wanted the bakery. And we believed it belonged to us.
E fra gli insetti e le zanzare, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 e fra gli insetti.
That's it for part 2. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed it. As always, we've got lots more information and photographs and the like on our website, workingclasshistory.com, linked in the show notes. Also in the show notes, we've got more information about Tariq's books, including his latest novel, You're Not Here. If you haven't heard it yet, our first episode is about the seminal Grunwick strike of East African Asian women workers around this same time period in London. The audio quality of it and technical side isn't great because we were still very much learning how this whole podcasting thing worked at the time, but we think the content is still interesting, so do check that out if you are interested. We're working on more episodes about Asian youth movements in different parts of Britain, so do subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss it. Sources of funding was an important theme in this episode. As WCH, we're not as important as groups like AYM, but we do value our independence, which is why we're entirely funded by you, our listeners on Patreon, with no corporate sponsors. We're taking time out from our day jobs to spend a lot more time working on the podcast and the WCH project through 2019. But this will only be sustainable beyond this point if we get more supporters on Patreon. So if you value what we do, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. In return, you get neat benefits like exclusive early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and other exclusive content. If you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or share our episodes on social media. Huge thanks to our Patreon supporters for enabling us to produce this episode. This episode was edited by Daniel Waldorf. Catch you next time.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 e le genti che passeranno.